My name is Serafina Cole. 2 years ago, in the most ordinary way possible, I was 26 years old, sitting alone in my apartment on a Tuesday night, eating instant noodles out of the pot because I hadn't bothered to find a bowl, scrolling through a creative writing forum at 2 in the morning like the deeply sophisticated adult that I was. Pause, I know. I had just moved to a new city. Portland, Oregon, rain-soaked, coffee-saturated, beautiful Portland. I had taken a job as a junior content strategist at a mid-sized tech company, and while the job itself was fine, the loneliness of being new somewhere was something I had completely underestimated. Every evening felt like a long hallway with no doors. I would come home, cook something barely edible, and disappear into the internet the way people disappear into books when the real world feels too quiet. That night I posted a short piece of fiction on the forum. Nothing serious. Just a scene I had written about two strangers meeting on a train, both of them too afraid to speak first, both of them watching the same rainstorm through the window, and thinking about love without realizing the person sitting across from them was thinking the exact same thing. I posted it, closed the tab, and went to sleep. The next morning I had one comment, just one, and it said, "I have read this 3 times already. Each time the ending hits differently. You write longing better than anyone I have encountered in a long time. Please write more." I stared at that comment for a full minute, then I clicked on the username. Evangeline Hart. Her profile was sparse, a small cartoon of a fox as her avatar, a bio that said simply, "Reader, overthinker, collector of beautiful sentences." No location, no social media links, no photo. I wrote back, "Thank you, that might be the kindest thing anyone has said to me this week," which admittedly is not saying very much given that I have mostly been talking to my houseplants. She responded within minutes, "Are the houseplants good listeners at least?" And just like that we were talking. For the first 2 weeks we existed entirely inside the comments section of that forum. Back and forth, sometimes about my writing, sometimes about hers, because it turned out Evangeline Hart could write too. She had a style that was completely different from mine. Where I wrote in long, sweeping emotional waves, she wrote in short, precise sentences that hit you like small stones against glass. Sharp, clear, impossible to ignore. She wrote a piece about watching a sunset from an airplane window and described it as the sky apologizing for the whole day. I read it and genuinely had to sit down. I responded with 3 words, "That was unfair." And she sent back a laughing emoji and said, "Good unfair or bad unfair?" And I said, "The kind of unfair that makes me want to delete everything I have ever written." She said, "Don't you dare." I didn't. 2 weeks became a month. We moved from the forum comments to private messages. Then from private messages to exchanging email addresses and writing long, rambling letters to each other at odd hours of the night. The kind of letters that start with one topic and somehow end up 3 pages later on an entirely different continent of thought. Letters about childhood memories, about favorite films, about the specific kind of sadness that comes with Sunday evenings, about what it feels like to love a song so much that you're almost afraid to play it too many times in case it loses its magic. She told me she was afraid of pigeons but loved all other birds. I told her I once cried at a furniture commercial. She said, "Which one?" I told her. She said, "Oh, I also cried at that one. We don't need to talk about this further." And somehow that exchange felt more intimate than 100 ordinary conversations. I knew fairly early on that I had feelings for her, real feelings, the kind that settle into your chest like something warm and heavy and don't leave when you try to logic them away. I am a lesbian. I had known that about myself since I was 19, though I had spent several years before that in the exhausting project of pretending otherwise. But I had never fallen for someone I had never met. Never fallen for a voice I had never heard, a face I had never seen, a laugh I could only imagine. With Evangeline, I was imagining constantly. I imagined her as someone quiet in crowds but electric in private. Someone who made tea instead of coffee and read books with a pencil in hand, underlining things that mattered. Someone with kind eyes and careful hands, and a laugh that surprised her sometimes, like it arrived before she expected it. I had no idea if any of that was true, but I held those imaginations like photographs. 3 months in, Evangeline sent me a voice memo, just 30 seconds long. She said, "I realize you have never heard my actual voice and I thought that was strange enough that I should do something about it. So, hello, this is what I sound like. Don't be alarmed, I promise I am not as serious in real life as I am in my writing. Actually, I might be more serious. disregard that. I played it 4 times. Her voice was lower than I had expected, calm and measured, with a warmth underneath it that the written word had been hinting at but hadn't quite delivered. There was a slight smile in it, the kind you can hear without seeing. And there was something else, something I couldn't name right away, something that sounded like she was trying very hard to seem casual about something that wasn't casual at all. I recorded a voice memo back. I deleted it 6 times before sending. In the final version I said, "Your voice sounds exactly like your writing, which is the best compliment I know how to give. Also, you were right. You are a little more serious in real life. I find that extremely endearing." She responded in text, "Endearing, I'm writing that down." 2 weeks after that, we had our first phone call. It lasted 4 hours and 22 minutes. We talked about everything, about our families, our histories, our cities. She told me she lived on the East Coast but didn't specify where. I told her I had moved to Portland from a small town in Ohio. She asked if I missed Ohio. I said, "I miss the people, I don't miss the geography." She laughed, and the sound of it was exactly as I had imagined it, except better because it was real. At 2 in the morning, when neither of us could keep our eyes open, she said, "I should let you sleep." And I said, "Probably." And then neither of us hung up for another 20 minutes. By month 4, I was fully, completely, devastatingly in love with Evangeline Hart, and I had not told her, not in those words, not directly. We had danced around it in the way that 2 writers dance around things, which is to say with tremendous elegance and absolutely no efficiency. Every letter contained something that sounded like love, dressed up as admiration. Every phone call ended with a warmth that felt like something unspoken pressing against the inside of a closed door. I didn't know what she wanted. I didn't know how she identified. I didn't know if what she felt for me was what I felt for her, or something different, something softer, a deep friendship that I was misreading through the lens of longing. So I waited, and I wrote, and I called, and I fell further. Meanwhile, my actual physical 3-dimensional life had taken an unexpected turn. After 8 months at the mid-sized tech company, I had been offered a new position. Senior Content Director at a company called Hartwell Innovations. Hartwell Innovations was not mid-sized. Hartwell Innovations was, by most measures, one of the most influential tech investment firms on the West Coast. They funded startups, managed a portfolio worth several $billion, and their headquarters in downtown Portland was the kind of building that made you feel slightly underdressed just walking past it on the sidewalk. The CEO and founder of Hartwell Innovations was a woman named Eloise Hartwell, 42 years old, Stanford MBA, Forbes list regular, occasionally photographed at galas and charity events in the kind of effortless, understated way that suggested she had absolutely no interest in being photographed. She was, by all accounts, brilliant and demanding and private in a way that was almost mythological. Her personal life was essentially non-existent in the public record. No tabloid drama, no social media presence, no interviews about anything other than business. I had done my research, of course. When you are offered a job working directly under someone like Eloise Hartwell, you research. I had read every profile ever written about her. I had watched her 2 public keynote speeches on YouTube. I had read 3 years of company announcements and board letters, and had developed a clear picture of her professional self, which was formidably intelligent, exceptionally precise, and absolutely not someone you wanted to disappoint. Her personal self, complete mystery. I accepted the job, told myself I was ready, showed up on my first day in the best blazer I owned and the quiet terror of someone who has just agreed to swim in much deeper water. My first week at Hartwell Innovations was the steepest learning curve of my professional life. The pace was unlike anything I had experienced. Every meeting was dense with information. Every project had 17 moving parts. Every deadline was described in a tone that suggested it was more of a law of physics than a suggestion. Eloise Hartwell herself I saw only twice that week, both times briefly. Both times she was moving through the office with the particular energy of someone whose internal calendar has 48 hours in a day and they are using all of them. She acknowledged my presence with a nod on the first occasion and with 3 words on the second. The coal hire, my supervisor, a composed and efficient woman named Dara, confirmed. Eloise looked at me for approximately 2 seconds, nodded once, and walked on. I stood there and thought, okay, so that's what that feels like. By the end of the first week, I had also discovered that Eloise Hartwell had a personal assistant named Marcus, who was an absolute saint, that she took her coffee black and hated, when it sat longer than 4 minutes, that she had an almost supernatural ability to identify the weakest argument in any presentation within the first 90 seconds, and that she had a private office at the end of the executive floor that she occasionally worked in until 10 or 11 at night. None of this was unusual for a billionaire CEO. None of it told me anything about who she actually was. It was during my 3rd week at the company that something shifted. I was working late. It was past 8 in the evening, and most of the office had emptied out. I was finishing a content strategy deck that needed to be ready for a morning meeting, and I had made the rookie mistake of leaving the final third until the last few hours. The floor was quiet, just the hum of the HVAC and the distant sound of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had my headphones in. I was listening to a playlist Evangeline had recommended to me via email the week before, a collection of atmospheric instrumental pieces she said she listened to when she was trying to think clearly. It was, I had to admit, helping. At some point, I became aware that I was not alone. I felt it before I heard it, the presence of someone else in the space. I pulled out one earbud and turned. Eloise Hartwell was standing at the coffee station approximately 20 feet away, not making coffee, just standing there looking out at the city through the window, a mug already in her hand. She hadn't heard me, or if she had, she wasn't acknowledging it. She looked different, not the CEO, not the force of nature moving through the office at velocity, just a woman standing quietly, watching the rain. I didn't say anything. I put my earbud back in. I went back to my deck. But I looked up once more a few minutes later. She was still there, and there was something in her posture that I recognized, the specific stillness of someone who is utterly alone and has made their peace with it without being entirely at peace with it. I recognized it because I had worn it myself, in my apartment before Evangeline. I finished the deck. I saved it. I was packing up my bag when Eloise Hartwell spoke. "You are the coal hire." It wasn't a question this time. It was a statement, a confirmation, like she was filing me correctly in her mind. "Yes," I said, "Serafina Cole, I started 3 weeks ago." She turned from the window then, looked at me directly for the first time in a way that wasn't fleeting. Her eyes were a shade of grey that I would later struggle to describe accurately, not cold, precise, like a lens focused on exactly what it intended to look at. "Your onboarding deck," she said, "the one you presented Tuesday, the competitor analysis in Section 3, the framing was wrong." I felt my stomach tighten. "Wrong how?" "You framed our positioning as reactive. We are not reactive, we are anticipatory." She paused. "The difference matters more than people usually understand." I held her gaze. "I understand, I'll revise the framework." She looked at me for a moment longer. Then, "Good," and she walked away back toward her office. I stood there for a second, heart pounding. Then I thought, anticipatory versus reactive. That is actually a genuinely important distinction, and I turned it over in my mind the whole way home. My relationship with Eloise Hartwell evolved slowly, and then all at once, the way most important things do. For the first 6 months it was professional, demanding and exacting on her end, diligent and increasingly confident on mine. She had a habit of appearing at my desk unannounced, asking pointed questions about whatever I was working on, listening to my answers with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested in being surprised by what they heard. When I said something she agreed with, she would nod once and move on. When I said something she found interesting, she would pause, ask a follow-up question, and then disappear before I could gauge what she actually thought. It was maddening, and I discovered gradually entirely intentional. She wasn't withholding her approval to manipulate. She was genuinely uninterested in giving approval as currency. She wanted real thinking, and she would engage with real thinking on its own terms. One afternoon, 5 months in, I walked into a strategy session that she was running and pushed back on a campaign concept that 3 senior colleagues had already endorsed. I did it carefully. I laid out my reasoning. I cited the audience data. I suggested an alternative. The room was very, very quiet. Eloise looked at me from the head of the table, said nothing for a moment, then, "Run it past me in writing by end of day. The alternative." She moved on. My colleagues looked at me with expressions ranging from respect to barely concealed panic on my behalf. By end of day, she had emailed back, 2 sentences, "Your instinct is correct, we are pivoting." I read that email 5 times. During all of this, Evangeline and I were deepening. We were calling each other 3 or 4 times a week by this point, sometimes short calls, sometimes conversations that lasted until midnight. She had told me more about herself over these months. She worked in the private sector, something in investment or finance. She was vague about the specifics in a way that I didn't push. She was intensely private about her professional life, which I respected. Her personal life, the parts she shared, painted a picture of someone who found the world simultaneously fascinating and slightly exhausting. Someone who loved ideas more than events, who preferred one long, genuine conversation to a dozen superficial ones, who had, she admitted one night, been lonely for a long time in ways that she hadn't had language for until recently. Until recently, I said carefully, meaning. A pause, longer than her usual pauses. Meaning, she said, until a certain person on a writing forum posted a story about two strangers on a train and ruined my ability to be content with anything less than real connection. My heart readers relocated briefly to my throat. I said, that's one of the nicest things anyone has ever said to me. She said, it's one of the truest things I have ever said. 2 weeks later she told me she was gay, not dramatically, not as a revelation. Just in the middle of talking about a film she had watched, she said, I identified deeply with the main character, which I suppose makes sense given that I am also a gay woman who has spent a considerable amount of time not entirely knowing what to do about it. And then she continued talking about the film. I waited until she paused. Then I said, I am also a gay woman who has spent a considerable amount of time knowing exactly what to do about it and still not doing it. Silence, then very quietly she said, is that so? It wasn't a question, it was the beginning of something. We both knew it, and we let it sit in the air between us like a note held at the end of a song. That night after we hung up, I sat in my living room and said out loud to no one, I am in love with Evangeline Hart and I have no idea who she really is, and somehow that is the most certain I have felt about anything in my adult life. My houseplant did not respond, it never does, but I felt it was in agreement. The next week I told her, not in a dramatic declaration. Evangeline and I were not people who did dramatic declarations. We were people who circled around the truth with increasing closeness until the distance became impossible. So I wrote her a letter, a real one, typed and formatted as we always did with our longer thoughts. And in it, somewhere around the third paragraph, between talking about a book I had just finished and a question about her favorite season, I wrote, I think I should tell you that I am in love with you. I realize the geography of that is complicated, and the logistics are unclear and you might not feel the same way, in which case, please pretend I said something witty and moved on. But I have been a writer my whole life and I believe in saying true things, and this is the truest thing I know right now. You are the person I want to talk to about everything. You are the voice I hear in my head when I read something beautiful. You are the reason the Sunday evenings don't feel like long hallways anymore. And I am in love with you, the end. Also, what is your favorite season? I sent it at 11:43 at night. I did not sleep. She responded the next morning, a letter of her own, 4 pages, it began. You said the end as though you were closing something, but I think you may have meant the beginning. Let me start there. And what followed was 4 pages of the most beautiful, honest, breathtaking thing anyone had ever written to me. She talked about the fear of feeling too much. About the way she had built her life around precision and control, and how meeting me, even only through words and voices, had dismantled something in her that she hadn't even known was locked. She talked about loneliness as a habit and love as a disruption, and how she had never before this wanted to be disrupted. And then she said, to answer your question in the only honest way I can, I love you. Fully and inconveniently, and without any of the safety margins I usually insist upon. And my favorite season is autumn, obviously. Obviously, I said to myself, of course it's autumn. I called her immediately. She picked up on the second ring, neither of us spoke for a moment, and then she said very quietly, hello. And I said hello, and we both laughed, the kind of laugh that is also a relief, the exhale after a long, uncertain held breath. So I said, we are in love. We are in love, she confirmed, across an unknown number of miles with no photographs exchanged and no addresses shared, which is either very romantic or a logistical disaster. Both, I said, I think it's both. Yes, she said, that sounds right. We agreed that night to meet, not immediately. The idea of it was enormous, it needed handling carefully. We talked about it over the following weeks with the particular combination of excitement and terror that only that specific kind of anticipation produces. The plan, such as it was, she would come to Portland, 1 month from now. She had a work trip to the West Coast around that time anyway, she said. We would meet for coffee, somewhere public. Somewhere where neither of us could disappear too easily into the overwhelming reality of finally seeing each other. I agreed to all of this with the outward calm of someone who had absolutely no idea how they were going to survive the next month. The next month at work was significant for an entirely separate reason. Eloise Hartwell had started talking to me, not just asking questions about my work, actually talking. It started, of all places, in the elevator. We were both staying late. We stepped in at the same time, and instead of the usual professional silence, she said, "What are you reading right now?" I blinked. "Pardon." "Reading, book, essay, anything. What are you currently in the middle of?" I told her the title, a novel by a British author she apparently also admired. Her expression shifted slightly, something that in a person with more mobile features would have been delight. In Eloise, it was a precise kind of interest. "Which section?" I told her. She said, "The letter sequence." I nodded. She said, "It gets better, don't read ahead." The elevator opened. She walked out. The next day she left a book on my desk. No note, just the book, a collection of essays I had mentioned once in passing that I had been meaning to find. I looked up at her through the glass wall of her office. She was on the phone. She didn't look up. I put the book in my bag and felt something strange and warm settle in the back of my mind, something I chose not to examine too closely. Over the following weeks the conversations continued. Brief ones, scattered through the workday, nothing that would register to anyone watching as anything other than a senior executive engaging with a junior employee. But they felt, to me, like something else, like someone choosing very deliberately to let you see a small piece of them that they don't usually show. She told me once, late in the office, that she had been considering a piece of philanthropy work in educational access, that it was the thing she cared about most outside of the company, that she had grown up without resources in a way that people who met her now never assumed. She said it without sentimentality, just as fact, but it landed in me as something more than fact. She asked me another evening why I had left my previous job. I told her honestly, I had been good at it but I hadn't been challenged by it, and I needed to be challenged. I needed to feel like the work mattered. She looked at me for a moment and said, "That is exactly the right reason to leave a job." And then, after a pause, "For what it is worth, the work you do here matters. The way you think about it is not what I expected when I hired you." I asked what she had expected. She said, "Competence. I didn't expect the other thing." I asked what the other thing was. She looked slightly away. "Conviction," she said, and left the room. I stood there, heart doing something complicated, and I thought about Evangeline and her letters and the way love had a habit in my life of arriving quietly, from directions I wasn't watching. But I pushed that thought down. Hard. I was in love with Evangeline. That was real and declared and mutual. Eloise Hartwell was my boss. Eloise Hartwell was a mystery who was choosing to share small pieces of herself with a junior employee for reasons that were almost certainly professional and human, and entirely not what my overactive, romantically compromised brain was trying to construct them as. I was very firm about this with myself, repeatedly. The night it happened was a Thursday, 3 weeks before Evangeline was due to come to Portland. 21 days I had been counting. It was late, later than it should have been. I had been in back-to-back meetings all day and had finally retreated to my desk to do actual work around 5 in the afternoon. By 8, I was the last person on the floor outside of the executive level. The cleaning staff had come and gone. The city outside was doing its usual rain-soaked night thing. I was tired in the specific way you get tired when your mind has been working very hard and your body has been sitting still for 8 hours, and the combination is not restful for either. I picked up my phone. I looked at the time. 8:13. I thought about calling Evangeline. We usually talked later, but something about the exhaustion of the day made me want to hear her voice. Just for a minute. Just to remember that there was a world outside of decks and strategy meetings and the faint reflection of myself in the dark window. A world that contained autumn and letters and the particular laugh of a woman who thought I wrote longing better than anyone she had encountered in a long time. I opened my phone, went to her contact, pressed call. And then, from down the hall, from the direction of Eloise Hartwell's office, a phone began to ring. I heard it clearly. The floor was silent enough that sound carried, and what I heard was my phone's outgoing ringtone matched, simultaneously, by a ringing phone in the direction of the executive suite. I almost didn't register it. I was tired. It was one of those moments where your brain processes something and then decides it probably didn't actually process it and you nearly let it go. Except then the ringing down the hall stopped. And in my ear, in the place where Evangeline's voicemail usually began, there was silence, and then a voice. A voice that was not Evangeline's voicemail. A voice that was warm and low and slightly wary, the way someone sounds when they answer a call from a number they don't immediately recognize. A voice that said, "Hello. I know that voice. I know that voice." I sat completely still in my chair. My brain was doing the thing where it receives information that it cannot fit into any existing category and simply refuses to act for approximately 4 to 5 seconds. The phone was pressed to my ear. Down the hall, approximately 60 feet away, through a closed glass-walled office, I could see that the light was on in Eloise Hartwell's office. She said again, "Hello," a beat. "Evangeline, is that you?" She said my girlfriend's name. She said my girlfriend's name. My fingers, against all my best instincts, pressed the end call button, because my body had made a decision before my brain had caught up to what was happening, and the decision was to remove myself from whatever dimension of reality I had apparently just stepped into. I sat for 10 seconds, 20, the office was silent again, down the hall the light was still on, my phone was in my hands, screen dark, warm from my grip. Then my phone lit up. Incoming call. The name on the screen was the name I had been looking at for 14 months. Evangeline Hart, the woman I was in love with, the woman who I had just heard calling herself by that name to someone 60 feet away from me. The woman whose voice coming out of a phone in my boss's office had just rearranged every single thing I thought I knew about my life. I let it ring twice, 3 times, then I answered. Serafina, her voice, her real voice, not the composed, measured public voice, the voice she used when she was uncertain, slightly breathy, unguarded. "Is that you? That was you just now, wasn't it?" "Yes," I said. My own voice sounded far away, like someone else was using it. "That was me." "Then where are you?" And I, sitting in a dark office on the same floor as the office of Eloise Hartwell, said, "I'm at work." Another silence, longer this time, and I heard from 60 feet away and simultaneously in my ear a sound I had never heard Evangeline make before, a small, sharp exhale, the sound of someone whose world has just tilted on a completely unexpected axis. She said, "Serafina, what company do you work for?" And I said, my voice entirely steady in the way it gets when you are very, very far past shock, "Hartwell Innovations." The silence that followed was the longest I had ever experienced on a phone call. It lasted approximately 8 seconds. Those 8 seconds contained, I believe, more information and implication than most conversations manage in an hour. Then she said, very quietly, "Come to my office. I have walked down many hallways in my life. I have never walked one like I walked that one. It was 60 feet. It felt like 60 miles. Each step was the step of someone who is moving towards something that will either destroy everything or become the most important moment of their entire life. And the truly maddening thing was that I had no idea which one it was. The door to her office was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. Eloise Hartwell was standing on the far side of her desk. She had her phone in her hand. She was looking at me, and I was looking at her, and we were both for the first time in this entire story speechless. She looked different. I had seen Eloise Hartwell in many contexts over the past 7 months. I had never seen her look the way she looked in that moment. The precision was still there. The intelligence. The grey eyes that focused like a lens. But something else was there too. Something I had seen once before when I watched her standing alone at the window on a rainy night. Vulnerability. Rare and undefended and real. We looked at each other for a long time. And then I said, probably not the most eloquent thing I had ever said in my life, "You're Evangeline." She said, "You're Serafina." And then neither of us said anything for another long, impossible moment. I sat down, not because I was invited to, because my legs had made the decision that they were no longer willing to hold me upright through this. I sat in the chair across from her desk, the one where I had sat in meetings, the one where I had been questioned and challenged and shaped by a woman who had been who was. She sat too, on the edge of her desk, which I had never seen her do before. It was the most informal I had ever seen her be in a physical space, and she held her phone in both hands and looked at me with an expression that was entirely unreadable and also, somehow, completely clear. How long, I said, have you known who I was? I didn't, she said immediately. Not until right now. I knew you worked at the company. I didn't know you were you. A pause. I knew Serafina Cole, the content director. I didn't know Serafina, the writer on the forum. You never asked, I said, about my job. You always went vague when I asked about yours. You went vague too, she said. I assumed you had your reasons. I had mine. Privacy. Yes, I said, privacy. The word sat between us like something very small and very heavy. Evangeline Hart, I said, is that a pen name? Something moved across her face, the closest to a smile I had ever seen from her in a moment that wasn't entirely controlled. Hart is my middle name, she said. Eloise Hartwell, Eloise Hartwell. It is admittedly an absurd amount of heart. I looked at her. Your middle name is Hart, and your company is Hartwell. My father's name, she said, was Hartwell. My mother's contribution was the Hart. The combination was perhaps inevitable. A pause. The pen name made sense. It felt like the part of me that was mine, not the company, not the portfolio, just the part that reads and writes and stays up too late thinking about beautiful sentences. I thought about 4 pages, fully and inconveniently and without any of the safety margins I usually insist upon. I thought about the sky apologizing for the whole day. I thought about autumn, obviously. I thought about 14 months of letters and voice memos and phone calls, and the slow, trembling construction of something that I had thought was the most real thing in my life, and that had turned out to be even more real than I knew, because it had been happening in 2 layers simultaneously. The hidden layer and the visible one, the woman behind the screen and the woman behind the desk, one voice in my ear at midnight, and one voice across a conference table at 9 in the morning. 2 versions of the same person, and I had loved both of them without knowing they were the same. I pressed my hands flat against my knees, looked at the floor, then back up. What do we do, I said, with this? She was quiet for a moment, the measured quiet that I knew now from both directions, the Evangeline quiet that meant she was choosing her words with the precision she gave everything, and the Eloise quiet that meant she was thinking 5 moves ahead. Then she said, I don't know, and she said it in a way that I had never heard her say anything, without certainty, without direction, just the honest, small admission of not knowing, coming from a woman who always knew, who had built an entire empire on knowing. It was the most intimate thing she had ever said to me, in any version. I sat down, not because I was invited to, because my legs had made the decision that they were no longer willing to hold me upright through this. I sat in the chair across from her desk, the one where I had sat in meetings, the one where I had been questioned and challenged and shaped by a woman who had been who was. She sat too, on the edge of her desk, which I had never seen her do before. It was the most informal I had ever seen her be in a physical space, and she held her phone in both hands and looked at me with an expression that was entirely unreadable and also, somehow, completely clear. How long, I said, have you known who I was? I didn't, she said immediately. Not until right now. I knew you worked at the company. I didn't know you were you. A pause. I knew Serafina Cole, the content director. I didn't know Serafina, the writer on the forum. You never asked, I said, about my job. You always went vague when I asked about yours. You went vague too, she said. I assumed you had your reasons. I had mine. A pause. Privacy. Yes, I said, privacy. The word sat between us like something very small and very heavy. Evangeline Hart, I said, is that a pen name? Something moved across her face, the closest to a smile I had ever seen from her in a moment that wasn't entirely controlled. Hart is my middle name, she said. Eloise Hartwell, Eloise Hartwell. It is admittedly an absurd amount of heart. I looked at her. Your middle name is Hart, and your company is Hartwell. My father's name, she said, was Hartwell. My mother's contribution was the Hart. The combination was perhaps inevitable. A pause. The pen name made sense. It felt like the part of me that was mine, not the company, not the portfolio, just the part that reads and writes and stays up too late thinking about beautiful sentences. I thought about 4 pages, fully and inconveniently and without any of the safety margins I usually insist upon. I thought about the sky apologizing for the whole day. I thought about autumn, obviously. I thought about 14 months of letters and voice memos and phone calls, and the slow, trembling construction of something that I had thought was the most real thing in my life, and that had turned out to be even more real than I knew, because it had been happening in 2 layers simultaneously. the hidden layer and the visible one, the woman behind the screen and the woman behind the desk, one voice in my ear at midnight and one voice across a conference table at 9 in the morning. Two versions of the same person, and I had loved both of them without knowing they were the same. I pressed my hands flat against my knees, looked at the floor, then back up. "What do we do?" I said, "with this?" She was quiet for a moment, the measured quiet that I knew now from both directions, the Evangeline quiet that meant she was choosing her words with the precision she gave everything, and the Alois quiet that meant she was thinking 5 moves ahead. Then she said, "I don't know," and she said it in a way that I had never heard her say anything, without certainty, without direction, just the honest, small admission of not knowing, coming from a woman who always knew, who had built an entire empire on knowing. It was the most intimate thing she had ever said to me. In any version, what happened next was not simple. I want to be honest about that. Love stories in their telling have a tendency towards smoothness that real love doesn't always have. Real love is messy. It requires things of you. It requires honesty with people who deserve it. It requires patience with yourself and with the other person, and with the inconvenient fact that life has structure and consequence that don't pause for feelings. We were honest with the board. Alois was thorough and clear about it. My role was restructured so that I no longer reported to her directly. I reported to the chief creative officer, a woman named Simone who was excellent at her job and treated the whole situation with what I can only describe as brisk professional acceptance and zero unnecessary drama. The restructuring, she told me privately, was reasonable and appropriate. And then she never mentioned it again. The weeks that followed were a navigation. At work we were professional, scrupulously so, the kind of professional that if you didn't know what you knew you would see only as a senior executive and a creative director who communicated clearly and respected each other's thinking, which was also true, which had always been true. That part at least didn't need to change. Outside of work we were learning each other again. The third version, not Serafina and Evangeline on the forum, not Serafina the hire and Alois the CEO in the office, but Serafina and Alois, the full, complicated, real human people, with histories and habits and fears and all the small ordinary things that you only learn about someone when you are present for the texture of their daily life. I learned that Alois Hartwell made tea in the morning before coffee, which I found deeply eccentric and told her so. She told me that coffee on an empty stomach was a form of self-vandalism, and she refused to participate. I learned that she had a habit of marking pages in books with train tickets, old ones, from places she had travelled. She had a jar of them on her windowsill and would use whichever was nearest at hand. I asked her once where a particular yellow one was from. She looked at it for a long moment and said, "Glasgow, 2019. I was there for a conference that I almost didn't go to. I'm glad I did." She didn't explain further. I didn't ask. Some things are not yours to ask for until they are offered. I learned that she was, privately, quite funny, not performing humour, not the social version of funny that people deploy at parties, but the specific, dry, quietly devastating kind of funny that arrives in one sentence when you are not expecting it and leaves you laughing after she has already moved on. The Fox avatar on the writing forum suddenly made complete sense. There was something Fox-like about her, quick and private and sharper than you expected when you finally looked directly at it. She learned things about me too, that I talked to my houseplants. She received this information without judgment, which I appreciated. That I had a tendency to make very detailed plans and then improvise entirely when the moment arrived. That I cried at certain kinds of music and was completely unmoved by other things that generally made people cry. That I was braver in writing than in speech and spent a lot of my life trying to close that gap. She said about that last one, "You are braver in speech than you think. You just don't notice it because you are in the middle of it." I sat with that for a long time. The first time she took my hand was not a grand gesture. We were walking along the waterfront on a Sunday afternoon. The way we had started doing on Sundays when the weather permitted, which in Portland was an optimistic framing since the weather only intermittently permitted anything. It was autumn by then, obviously. The trees were doing the thing trees do in autumn, which is to say they were being aggressively beautiful in the specific way that makes you sad and grateful simultaneously. We were talking about something, I don't even remember what, and she just reached over and took my hand. No announcement. No ceremony. She simply took my hand the way you take something you have decided belongs to you, not in a claiming way but in a keeping safe way, and she kept walking, and kept talking, as if it were the most natural thing. I did not say anything. I kept walking too. But I think I smiled the entire rest of the afternoon. The first time she said she loved me out loud in person, standing in her kitchen at 11 on a Saturday night, while we were both pretending to be more interested in the pasta we were making than in the conversation we were actually having, was also not a grand gesture. She just said it, in a sentence about something else. The thing I have understood this year is that love is not the risk I thought it was. It is more frightening than that. It is not a risk, it is a requirement. It is what happens when you meet someone and your life rearranges itself around the fact of them, which is what happened. With you, I love you, Serafina. I have loved you since the forum. I have loved you since the office. Both times I didn't know it was the same love. Now I know, and it is. I looked at the pasta, it was boiling. I turned off the burner, then I turned to her. Eloise, I said, I have loved you in 3 different ways, the way you love a voice in the dark, the way you love a mind that challenges you, and the way you love a person when you finally, after all of it, just see them. I paused. All 3 ways have the same name. She looked at me for a moment. Then, the pasta is going to be terrible now. I don't care about the pasta, I said. Neither do I, she said. And she kissed me. I have been asked since all of this unfolded what I think about the coincidence of it, the improbability, the 2 in a million chance of a junior employee and a billionaire CEO finding each other first on a writing forum in the middle of the night before finding each other in a building in downtown Portland. And every time I am asked, I give the same answer, which is, I don't think it was a coincidence. Not because I am superstitious, not because I believe in fate as a mechanical thing that moves people around a board, but because I believe that we are drawn to the things that call to us, that a woman who needed something true in a life that had become entirely managed found her way to a place where truth was the whole point, and that another woman who was lonely in a way she had almost stopped namming found the same place for the same reason. And that 2 people who thought in the same patterns and loved in the same language and were hungry for the same kind of realness found each other there, and then found each other again. Because they were always going to. Because the things that belong together tend eventually to find their way. It has been 14 months now since that Thursday night when I dialed a number in a dark office and heard a phone ringing 60 feet away. 14 months since the world rearranged itself in the space of a hallway walk. In those 14 months, Eloise and I have travelled to 3 countries together. She navigates airports the way she navigates everything, with absolute efficiency and 0 visible stress. I navigate airports by buying coffee at every single opportunity and reading departure boards as if they are poems. We have somehow not driven each other completely mad in transit. This feels like a good sign. She has started writing again, under her own name this time, or rather both names together, Eloise Hart Hartwell, the full, absurd, entirely accurate name. She published a short essay in a literary journal about growing up without money in a country that associates worth with wealth. It was precise and devastating, and 13,000 people shared it online in the first 24 hours. She was publicly entirely composed about this. At home, she sat in the kitchen reading the responses with a very specific expression that I recognized as the feeling of having been seen. I didn't make a big thing of it. I just made tea and sat across from her, and we read quietly together for an hour. I have been promoted, twice. The first promotion was straightforward, earned by work that was evaluated by people who had no particular stake in my personal life. The second was to a role that Simone offered with the observation that I was, at this point, doing the job anyway, and they should probably just acknowledge that formally. I accepted. The Creative Writing Forum still exists. I post there occasionally. Eloise posted something there 3 months ago under a new username, a tiny piece about watching someone sleep and understanding in that moment what home actually means. I read it in the morning when she sent it to me. I cried. She knew I would cry. She had left a box of tissues on my desk. People sometimes ask me, what was the best part? Was it the forum, the first recognition of each other's minds? Was it the letters, those long and honest and carefully chosen words? Was it the phone calls, the voice in the ear in the dark? Was it the hallway, the walk toward the lit office? Was it the first hand-holding, the first, I love you? The first ordinary Saturday morning of cereal and arguing about whether tea before coffee is madness? I always say all of it. It was all of it, every layer, every version. The hidden one and the visible one, the midnight self and the daylight self. Because love, real love, doesn't require you to be one thing. It requires you to be all your things, the writer and the director, the lonely and the found, the certain and the terrified, the person who talks to houseplants and the person who uses train tickets as bookmarks. all of it together, held in the hands of someone who sees every version and chooses all of them. That is what love is. That is what I learned, from a writing forum and a voice in the dark and a phone that rang 60 feet down a hallway and changed everything. It is a Sunday in October, the specific kind of October Sunday that Portland does better than anywhere, overcast in the way that is actually beautiful, the smell of rain that has just happened and rain that is about to happen again. The trees along the waterfront are in their full autumn excess, unreasonable and gorgeous. We are walking the way we do on Sundays. Eloise has my hand. She has had my hand on Sundays for a long time now. It is no longer notable, it is just true. She is telling me something about the investment she is considering. Something to do with educational technology and accessibility. I am listening the way I listen when she talks about things she cares about, which is, completely with the part of my brain that is always slightly amazed by the way her mind works, by the specificity of her care, by the way she has always known, even when the world presented her as purely transactional, what actually matters. I am also thinking quietly about a story I am writing, not for the forum, for myself, a story about two people who found each other twice, about how love is not always a straight line, but it arrives eventually where it was always going. She glances at me, she can tell when I am thinking about writing, she says, "You have your writing face." I am thinking about a story, I say. About us. I pause, think about it honestly. About love, I say, about what it is, about how it doesn't always look like you expect. She is quiet for a moment, then with the small, devastating precision that is entirely and completely her, "No, it usually looks much better." I look at her, the grey eyes, the autumn light, the hand in mine, both versions of her, all versions of her. Eloise and Evangeline and the woman standing here on a Sunday who is both of those people and also irreducibly herself. I think, yes, it usually looks much better. The rain begins again. We keep walking. Neither of us mentions finding shelter. Neither of us would trade this for anything indoors. This is the story of how I called my online girlfriend, and my billionaire boss's phone started ringing. This is the story of how I learned that love has a way of finding the right people in the wrong order, and then quietly correcting itself. This is the story of Serafina Cole and Eloise Hartwell, who are by any measure exactly where they are supposed to be. And if you are out there somewhere writing to a stranger on the internet at 2 a.m, because the real world feels too quiet, and you are not sure who will hear you, or where it will lead, or whether the beautiful thing you are building in the dark will survive contact with the light, keep writing. It might surprise you. It might lead you 60 feet down a hallway and change your entire life.